Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
David met Claire in business school. She was studying psychology and, from the start, stood out for being perceptive and articulate. She wasn't the most outgoing, but she had a striking presence, the kind you remember days later even if you only exchanged a couple of sentences. David was immediately charmed during their first group project together. She listened attentively, gave firm opinions, and had an intelligence that, to him, bordered on charm. They started as colleagues, then became friends, and before they realized it, they were inseparable. They went to class together, studied side by side for exams, and talked about the future with the same excitement as someone who feels they're going to conquer the world. The romance developed naturally, without the need for grand declarations. They understood each other with just looks and inside jokes. Claire supported every one of David's crazy ideas, from the app projects he never finished to his plans to start a tech and health startup. She encouraged him even when he doubted himself. When they graduated, the decision to get married felt almost obvious. They had already been living as a couple for a while, they were just formalizing what they both already felt. The wedding was simple, organized with the help of a few friends. No luxuries, but full of emotion. With diplomas in hand and the title of husband, David dove headfirst into the startup world. He worked freelance, taking on small system development projects. Sometimes the money was only enough for the basics, but Claire always found a way to ease the burden of expenses. She worked part-time at a clinic and did online psychology freelancing. On top of that, she kept the house running with impeccable organization. Even with little, the two made special dinners on Sundays and had a rule of sleeping hugged up, no matter how the day went. They had 2 tough years. David kept pushing an idea that few understood, a system that, according to him, could change how small clinics stored and accessed patient data. He knocked on many doors, received countless rejections, heard jokes, criticism, and advice to give up. But Claire believed. Whenever he considered changing fields, she said it was just a phase, that success was a matter of time, and that he couldn't abandon what made him passionate. She said these words with such conviction that he felt ridiculous doubting himself. It was during a meeting with an anonymous investor, hastily arranged by an acquaintance, that everything began to change. David presented the project with different energy. He spoke clearly, dominated the proposal, and, most importantly, exuded confidence. The investor asked for a week to evaluate. During that time, Claire prepared a special dinner and told him that, regardless of the response, he had already won by not giving up. When the investment was approved, they celebrated hugging in the living room, crying like children. With the financial backing, David built a small team, rented an office, and within months, the system was operational in 3 clinics. Then 10. When it reached 50, a larger company offered a multi-million-dollar deal to buy part of the operation. David hesitated, but Claire insisted it was the right moment to accept and grow securely. Selling part of the company would be like securing their future and opening space for new ideas. He agreed. With the money came changes. They bought a modern house with a pool, an imported SUV, and new furniture. Claire took charge of the decoration, hired a personal organizer, and even took an interior design course to make everything reflect their style. They traveled abroad for the first time. Paris, London, then Thailand. David took pictures of everything and said he was living the best moment of his life. He proudly spoke of the woman by his side, who had been there when they had nothing. She smiled whenever she heard that, responding with affectionate words. On social media, the two looked like a couple from a bank commercial, young, successful, and in love. But, at times, David noticed Claire seemed a bit distant. He attributed it to exhaustion or stress from the changes. He ignored it. After all, everything was going well. Their love had overcome poverty, time, and the skepticism of many. But this unwavering certainty that he was with the perfect woman kept David from seeing the subtle signs that were starting to appear. He remained blind with gratitude. He credited all his success to her. He said that without Claire, he would never have succeeded. It was true that she had supported him when he needed it most. But what he didn't know was that, at the exact moment he repeated those words with pride, Claire was already shaping another version of the story. A version where her effort carried more weight than it actually did. A version that, sooner or later, would turn against him, and in the most unexpected way possible. Claire was different. This was clear to anyone who spent more than 15 minutes with her. She no longer smiled the same way when David hugged her, avoided direct questions about the future, and frequently used vague excuses to go out alone. First, she said she needed time for herself. Later, she claimed she wanted to reconnect with old friends. David, always respectful, understood and said she deserved some time for herself. Little did he know that, during one of these reunions, Claire had crossed paths with Brian again. Brian had been a co-worker of hers years earlier when she was still an intern at a small consulting firm. He was charismatic, with sharp talk and silent ambition. Back then, their relationship had been purely professional, but there was latent tension between them, barely disguised by compliments and subtle jokes. When Claire reconnected with him, she felt something that wasn't exactly nostalgia. It was as if this reunion reignited a version of herself that had been dormant through years of stable marriage with David. They met for coffee. At first glance, it was all very restrained, but Brian's gaze was calculated, as if he already knew this moment was just the beginning. They talked about life, the paths they'd taken, and how everything seemed different now. Claire spoke about the marriage but used neutral words, as if describing the routine of some random acquaintance. Brian noticed there was room to step in. He didn't need to push. He just stayed present. On the second meeting, subtle compliments. On the third, a prolonged touch on her hand as they said goodbye. By the time she realized it, she was already caught up in something she couldn't, or didn't want to, stop. Claire wasn't impulsive. If she were, she would have fallen into Brian's arms without a second thought. But she was strategic. And with Brian, strategy became the rule. He now worked in corporate law, specializing in asset protection and business restructuring. When she told him how much David had earned, Brian's eyes lit up with a specific kind of interest, one that mixed desire with calculation. It was he who planted the idea that, with the right plan, that money could become hers. Not as a dirty trick, but as an intelligent redistribution. Legal, documented, clean. Claire resisted at first. There was still a trace of guilt, a voice inside reminding her of everything David had done for her. But Brian had sharp arguments and a way of speaking that turned doubts into decisions. You're not trying to take anything away from him by force. You just want to secure what's rightfully yours. After all, without you, he wouldn't have gotten where he is. That phrase broke the last barrier. She began to act. First, she dropped comments during dinners with David about the importance of protecting assets against potential labor disputes, shareholder conflicts, or future economic crises. She said many couples put part of their assets in one person's name as a protective measure. That it was common. That she had heard it from an old colleague. David, who trusted her blindly, agreed without blinking. He thought Claire just wanted to help. With Brian's help, she prepared the right documents. Suggestions for asset restructuring, account transfers, small contracts for ownership changes. All with specific clauses but wrapped in legality. David's signature was a detail. She handled the paperwork herself, and he, trusting that his wife understood these matters better, simply signed. Between meetings and trips, part of the assets was already in Claire's name, and David had no idea of the extent. The second part of the plan was more delicate, the prenuptial agreement update. When they got married, both were students. Their marriage contract was basic, drafted by a family lawyer they knew. But now, with companies, investments, and international holdings, Claire suggested an update. She said it would be prudent to avoid headaches if David's company faced lawsuits. She argued that each should have their own lawyer for personal protection. David thought it was fair. He was so immersed in the company's success, new businesses, and interviews for newspapers that he didn't realize he was being led with precision. Brian stayed behind the scenes. He guided Claire with encrypted emails, deleted messages, and meetings in places where they could never be recognized. Their relationship was more tactical than romantic. There was passion, yes, but what united them was something more powerful: ambition. While Claire infiltrated the finances and slowly undermined the marriage structure, Brian mapped out the legal strategies. They studied David's behavior as if it were a clinical case. Every mistake of his was noted. Every confession was recorded. Every impulsive decision was turned into a useful piece on the board they were building. Claire knew her limits. She kept the marriage functional on the outside. Smiled in photos, organized events, wrote loving cards for special occasions. It was all part of the disguise. At the same time, she nurtured the idea that success had changed David. In conversations with acquaintances, she let slip that he was distant, cold, more focused on numbers than on her. When he traveled for work, she took the opportunity to advance negotiations with Brian. During those moments, they drafted the next phase, calculating each step with cold precision. In the eyes of the world, Claire remained the devoted and grateful wife. But inside, she no longer had an emotional connection to David. There were goals. Objectives. A destiny plotted alongside someone she saw as an equal. She didn't just want to run away with Brian. She wanted to leave big. Rich. With everything documented, legalized, and out of reach of any challenge. She wasn't fleeing the marriage. She was converting it into profit. Claire's plan entered its most dangerous phase when she began rewriting the history of the marriage, detail by detail, with one goal: generating evidence. Everything that once seemed small and insignificant became a piece in a puzzle she manipulated with precision. Arguments that used to resolve in minutes were now deliberately prolonged. Any sharp response from David was noted. On some occasions, she subtly provoked, asking ambiguous questions, seeking some harsh reaction, however brief, however insignificant. When David responded impatiently, Claire used it as an argument with her lawyer. Context didn't matter. Only the record mattered. She began saving screenshots of out-of-context messages, recordings of conversations where David seemed distant, and even short videos where he appeared absorbed in his phone while she talked about something supposedly important. To any outsider, Claire was the neglected wife, ignored, someone fighting for attention in an unbalanced relationship. And the more David focused on the business, the more vulnerable he became. He trusted too much. He devoted his days to expanding the company and his nights to rest he believed he deserved, unaware that on the other side of the bed, a strategy was underway. Brian analyzed every document Claire sent, every transaction she managed to obtain. They communicated at set times, always using an app with self-destructing messages. She left no traces. No saved history. No notes, no names mentioned aloud. When she needed to meet him, she said she was attending networking events or visiting a sick friend. David never questioned. He trusted completely. The next step was the complete mapping of the assets. Claire knew about all the investments, properties, accounts, and joint accounts. She knew the passwords, the access, and the banking contacts. When necessary, she discreetly forwarded statements to Brian. He created spreadsheets with legal simulations. He knew what could be frozen, what could be contested, and, above all, what could be transferred, cleanly, to her name before the separation. The coldness of the process impressed even Claire, who had hesitated in some decisions before but now acted with conviction. She had convinced herself it was justice. That she was reclaiming what was rightfully hers. When she felt she had gathered everything she needed, Claire began discussing with her lawyer the allegations that would support the divorce petition. She would claim emotional exhaustion, invisibility within the marriage, silent overload, and lack of reciprocity. She would have witnesses. Records. Everything. And David? He had trust. Just that. Too much trust. That night, Claire came home later than usual. David was in the living room, finishing reviewing a contract. She watched him for a few seconds before speaking. She said she needed to talk. He put down the papers, worried. Asked if everything was okay. She took a deep breath and began with the sentence she had been rehearsing for weeks. She said she felt the marriage had transformed into something she no longer recognized. That despite everything they had lived through, she felt they were on different paths. She used words he never expected to hear. She avoided crying because she knew tears would create room for doubt, and she was past the stage of doubts. David tried to understand. He asked if there was someone else. She said it was about her, an internal process. She avoided direct confrontations. Said she needed this space. And that divorce would be the best decision for both. He sat silently for a while, then said that if that's what she wanted, he would respect it. He still believed it was temporary. That maybe she'd change her mind. That with time, everything might work out. But what he didn't know was that while he slept that night, Claire had already sent the final files to her lawyer. She had everything ready. The petitions were prepared, the documents organized, and the arguments written based on weeks of meticulous collection. In less than 15 days, David received the official notification. As he read the allegations, he felt as though he were reading someone else's story. The woman he knew had been replaced by a version he didn't recognize. Trying to react was like fighting an invisible enemy. Every point he tried to question was already backed by evidence. The videos, the audio recordings, the documents. Everything supported Claire's narrative. The judge reviewed the case and ruled in her favor. He cited emotional imbalance, prolonged wear, and lack of active contribution from David in maintaining domestic life. The ruling was clear. Claire walked away with more than half of everything. Accounts, properties, investments. Even future profits from the company were partially compromised. He spent days in shock. The amount lost was enormous, but what hurt the most was knowing that it had all been done legally. Without yelling, without scandals, without blackmail. A blow executed with precision, backed by documents and carried out by someone he loved. He lost the house, the assets, and part of the company he had spent years building. But what weighed most heavily was the emptiness. The feeling of being betrayed by someone in whom he had placed his entire history. The news began to circulate cautiously but soon reached the ears of friends and colleagues in the industry. Many found David's silence strange. He refused to talk about it. He only continued showing up for mandatory commitments, with a distant look. He was alive, but part of him had stayed there, in that cold and calculated process, executed by someone who said she loved him. And the other part was now consumed by a new question that wouldn't leave him in peace: where was Claire? David went weeks without any sign of life. If before his routine was driven by goals and deadlines, now it was guided by silence and disbelief. He closed the curtains, avoided phone calls, and only left the house for essentials. His days felt crumpled, repetitive. He ate lunch out of obligation and pretended to work, just to avoid being fully consumed by apathy. The few friends who tried to approach him were met with short answers and a lost gaze. The man who had built a company from scratch could no longer fill out a form without feeling defeated. Claire's betrayal had pierced everything he believed was solid. One day, while drinking coffee with his eyes fixed on the laptop screen, he received a notification from an online economic newspaper. The headline read, "Businessmen targeted in alleged $1 million divorce fraud." It was him. The article briefly recounted the case, without mentioning all the details, but enough to intrigue a lawyer in another city, specialized in patrimonial crimes and international law. The lawyer's name was Richard Myers. Respected in legal circles, he was known for taking on difficult cases and his firm performance in international courts. After finishing the article, Richard sensed something was off about how everything had unfolded. He sent David a direct email with a simple offer to help, without upfront costs, until he understood what was really behind the process. David was suspicious. He thought it might be some kind of scam or trap. But Richard didn't push. He just left his contact information and said that if David wanted to talk, he'd be available. Almost a week later, David called. The conversation lasted over 2 hours. He told everything, down to the smallest detail. Richard listened in silence, jotting down information, cross-referencing data, asking pointed questions. When it was over, he simply said, "You were intelligently manipulated, but there are flaws in their plan. I can see where." And it was at that moment that David, for the first time in months, felt a faint internal reaction. It wasn't hope yet, but it was close. Richard entered the case with the same focus he used in major international disputes. He began by reviewing all the asset movements made in the past 2 years. He studied the divorce documents, analyzed the bank records, and cross-checked information with companies abroad. He noticed that Claire and Brian had made a crucial mistake. To try to hide part of the money, they transferred funds to accounts in the names of individuals already under investigation for money laundering in other cases. One of those names appeared on an Interpol monitoring list, which opened a significant breach. With the evidence gathered, Richard activated international justice and initiated a case for capital flight, patrimonial fraud, and conspiracy. The case gained traction quickly. It was clear that the transfers made by Claire and Brian aimed to circumvent the legal system. Several were inconsistent with the declared origin of the funds. And the companies used to move the money didn't exist at all, they were just fronts. Meanwhile, David went back to work. He created a new project focused on asset protection in marital relationships and legal restructuring for small businesses. He used the pain as fuel. His new digital system offered solutions for asset shielding and risk analysis in marital contracts. The project grew quickly, with support from investors who believed in the system's potential, and in the story of the man who created it. 2 years after Richard's first message, justice responded. Claire and Brian were located in a European country and summoned to testify. With the support of international courts, they were detained to face the charges. The news spread through the media. Business and law websites commented on the turnaround as an exemplary case of how legality can be used to cover coldly calculated plots, and how, with the right help, it can also pave the way for justice. David attended the hearing. He watched Claire enter the room accompanied by 2 foreign lawyers. She looked thinner, tired, but still maintained a certain air of superiority. When their eyes met, she hesitated. David said nothing. He just observed. Brian tried to justify the transfers, but the documents gathered by Richard were irrefutable. The court ordered the freezing of assets and the restitution of the embezzled funds. More than 2/3 of the original amount was recovered. At the end, the reporter asked if he would ever forgive Claire. David was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's understanding that moving forward is more powerful than looking back." And as the camera focused on his determined face, thousands of people heard that story as both a warning and a reminder that no matter how trust is broken, justice can still surprise. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.